Hey, this is Sam Black with my first match with my mostly blue cube draft deck. I won the die roll, so I will be on the play for the first game. And I decided to keep this hand. It's pretty questionable, especially on the play, but I think turn 1 Ancestral Vision is really powerful in my deck. And if I draw a second land, I can impulse for a third land. Brain Freeze isn't great in my opening hand, but that doesn't really matter. And I have Izzet Charm plays well with Treasure Cruise. I expect to be able to impulse into red mana, so I think it's definitely on the risky side, but especially since I do get to spend the Ancestral Vision, well, it means that if I miss land drops, I'm less likely to discard. On the other hand, when the visions goes off, I'm more likely to discard if I've missed land drops, so the value that I get for having it in my opening hand definitely goes down. Certainly, this hand doesn't present a clock. If I thought that my deck needed to, that would be a big problem. Also, the fact that I don't have any counter spells, so if I draw lands, except for Izzet Charm, if I draw lands, I won't be able to counter stuff, and then I'll be behind. Shackles is a big part of being able to recover from that, but this is still definitely a questionable keep. But I decided to try it out. Spend Ancestral Vision. My opponent plays a tapped land. I draw a counter spell, so roughly the best thing I could draw that's not a land or a 1-mana spell. And now I miss again, and we're getting into some trouble, but at least my opponent hasn't done anything, and still doesn't do anything. So not all hope is lost, and I draw a land here before the Visions resolves, which is pretty good. It means that I'm going to be discarding fewer cards than the Vision resolves and less far behind. Also, it gives me a red source, so I can use my Izzet Charm and fire if I need to. And now, yes, I've missed some land drops, but my opponent hasn't done anything to get on board, and I have answers for potential plays. Counterspell answering anything is good, and I'm going to be able to hit my third land drop at the very least because of Ancestral Vision, and it's really unlikely that my opponent's going to not do anything for the first 4 turns, which means I'm probably going to get to use a card here, which is pretty important. And my opponent plays Nahiri, which I certainly want to counter, and I'm going to use Izzet Charm rather than Counterspell because Counterspell is more valuable. And now the Visions goes off, and so I get to make my land drop. I will have to discard even if I play the Shackles, but only 1 card, and it powers up the Treasure Cruise, so it's really not that bad. But I don't want to discard 2 cards, so I think it's worth playing the Shackles, even though it means that I won't be able to counterspell something. I discard Fire Ice, because it seems unlikely at this point that my opponent's going to suddenly play a small creature, and I don't really need just tap a thing, draw a card. I think that Impulse, for example, is much more powerful, and I don't really want to discard Brain Freeze because my deck isn't really great at winning a game, and I might need it. So here my opponent resolves a different Planeswalker, which is definitely a problem. I don't have a great way to deal with it. Taps my Steam Vents, I draw another land, and I'm just going to play a land and obviously pass because I can't do anything. My opponent keeps my land tapped again. And so now I'm basically, at this point, I know that I can draw burn spells to slow Ajani down, and I can potentially trick my opponent into using Ajani to kill Jace, but if my opponent is just taking Ajani up to 7 and then using its ultimate to kill all my lands, that's a very strong play against me, and my only real way to beat it is to try to Brain Freeze my opponent out before that happens, and to do whatever I can to try to get my opponent to minus Ajani first, unless I can find an answer to it, but I don't have a lot. So I'm going to take the Delver here because Force Spike doesn't seem like it's going to matter this game, and I have more lands to play, and Delver threatens Ajani at least. So I'll just play the Delver. And my opponent's going to Kolaghan's Command, killing my 2 things, which would be pretty bad for me, so I think I have to counter it. And unfortunately my opponent gets to resolve something here and plays Dromoka. So this is interesting. It's really bad for me, except if I draw 1 more island, I can Shackles it. And I have 7 cards in my graveyard, so I can spend 1 mana to cruise. So having a Dromoka would be really good for me. That lets me actually answer this Ajani. So this is interesting. It's really bad, but has the potential to be really good. But you have to figure my opponent played it for a reason. But I don't have a lot of options about how I deal with it. My opponent minuses Ajani, so that's good. That means that that's less of an immediate threat. And I draw Firebolt, which can finish off the Ajani at some point. And I can even let the Ajani tick up 1 more time. So I don't have to double Firebolt now to kill it. I can Firebolt now and later. Or I can just use Firebolt to push Ajani back far enough that it's unlikely to ultimate and ignore it. So I'm just going to fire off the Treasure Cruise to try to find another island, which I do. And I'm going to take the Dromoka, because I can't do anything on my opponent's turn if I don't take the Dromoka, so I kind of have to do that. And play Thada because I can't do anything useful on my opponent's turn anyway, so I might as well just get it down, maybe get my opponent to minus Ajani again, because I don't really think Thada's going to do much other than that. And if my opponent minuses Ajani, then I can just kill it for a single mana with Firebolt and be done with it. So my opponent does that, and Maelstrom pulses my Shackles, so now they have Dromoka again, which without Shackles is a huge problem for my deck. It has more toughness than I can burn out, and it turns off a lot of what my deck is trying to do. So at this point, I'm now on a different clock. Instead of being clocked by Ajani, I'm being clocked by Dromoka, and I need to just try to brain freeze my opponent out. So I'm not a dedicated Storm deck, I'm just a deck that can cast a few spells and then brain freeze. So in order to actually deck my opponent with brain freeze, I'm probably going to need to find Snapcaster. So I decide to finish off the Ajani, or no, maybe, sorry, I consider going for the Ajani, but I think better of it, I hope, to save the Firebolt for Storm. Bounce the Dromoka and draw more cards to buy time, because the Mystic Confluence doesn't, with Dromoka in play, it's not a counter spell. The best I can do with it is return a creature, and now is probably the best time to do that, because it means that my opponent has to spend their next turn developing the Dromoka again, and I can just play some of these cards in my hand to try to set up. Whereas if I wait and let my opponent develop further, then it might not set them behind by as much because it doesn't reset their whole board. I could use it in the bounce multiple things mode, but I think it's better to just draw more cards now and try to do what I can. I think I thought pretty hard about this Firebolt, and on the one hand I wanted to keep it as a cheap spell to kill the Ajani and get a Storm count later. On the other hand, I didn't want to keep my mana locked down because I thought that I would need my mana to be developing and finding my stuff, and it's just riskier to leave it around, so I used the Firebolt to kill the Ajani. And my opponent does just replay Dromoka after figuring out how to properly tap for it. And I'm just going to use my Jace as a skip an attack step from Dromoka, get some more cards to try to get to the point where I can storm off. I find Thing in the Ice, which is another way to buy time against Dromoka, but I'm just going to compulsive research to try to find my combo first. I'm fine just letting the Dromoka hit Jace for a turn. And my opponent is casting something big, and it's Rakdos return for 6. So I was actually in pretty good shape here, I think. I think that it's likely that I was going to be able to deck my opponent before Dromoka kills me, but I can't possibly beat losing my hand here, so I just concede. So sideboarding, I switched into white to have answers to Dromoka, basically. I brought in Supreme Verdict and I think Unexpectedly Absent and Face Fettered for the Planeswalkers. The small burn was not killing anything in my opponent's deck, so white was far better. And I'm on the play here, of course, since I just lost. And I have, this is more what I'm looking for in a hand. I don't have the Ancestral Vision, but I can just get my mana out early, have a counterspell, and plenty of library manipulation to find what I need in a timely fashion. This is a normal good hand for a control deck. So I play Polluted Delta because I don't really want to draw more lands. I want to get a tap land, and it starts getting stuff in my graveyard for Delve. And just play the Signet here. The only counterspell that I can leave up is Daze, and I can use that anyway. Also, my opponent doesn't seem to be in the market for playing cheap spells that I need to deal with. They didn't show me any of those. I play a Signet, which is fine. I'm just going to let my opponent develop their mana because I'm not ending the game at any point, so there's just no reason to fight over it. I need to fight over their, they're going to have a chance to cast all their business spells, and I need to answer those. I don't want to also try to answer their mana. It just doesn't get me anywhere. I guess it potentially buys me more time to draw into more counter spells, but I think that's the wrong way to go in this kind of matchup. And I Compulsive Research, and I'll just discard the planes that I don't need because I have double white. And play my island. And my opponent is going to attempt to blow up my Signet and make me discard a card, but that's clearly not worth letting resolve because Daze is among my worst cards anyway, and I'd rather keep my Signet, and picking up the land doesn't really set me back since it keeps the Signet in play, and I might not have land to play otherwise. So Daze the Kolaghan's Command, play a land, and now I don't have a counterspell, but I can potentially find one with Anticipate or Impulse. And my opponent plays Mirari's Wake, which is pretty scary. So I'm gonna dig for a counter. Unfortunately, the way that my mana works, I can't leave up double blue. I find Brain Freeze, Dig Through Time, and 2 islands, and I definitely do want to keep playing lands at this point. So I'm also not really ready to use the Dig Through Time. I have plenty of business in my hand, and we're certainly not at a point where I need Brain Freeze. I'm not about to win with it, and I have Dragon Lord Ojutai if I felt like I needed to try to win the game quickly anyway. So I'm just going to take the island here and then anticipate to try to find more appropriate business. But obviously I can't find a counterspell at this point, so Mirari's Wake is just going to come down. And I take Snapcaster here. So I really think that I don't want to let my opponent untap with Mirari's Wake. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to Unexpectedly Absent, or no, Preordain first. See what's up. Then Treasure Cruise. Then Unexpectedly Absent to put it 1 from the top so that my opponent can't play it next turn, and then the turn after that I can try to find an answer to it. So without that, my opponent plays Batterskull, and I draw Mystic Confluence, which is the perfect card. It answers the Germ token from Batterskull and Mirari's Wake. So I just pass, and there's a decent chance that my opponent's going to play Mirari's Wake first to get an extra point, but does not decide to do that wisely. Hits me with the Germ, cast Mirari's Wake, and so now I get to use all 3 modes of Mystic Confluence to draw a card, bounce the Germ, and counter the Wake. And now my opponent's on 2 cards, and I'm fairly stable. There is a Batterskull in play, but that's not really an immediate concern, and I have Snapcaster Mystic Confluence to keep my opponent out, plus Ojutai to end the game. So here, I could Faith's Fetters the Batterskull to stop my opponent from returning it and playing it again. My opponent also has a Raging Ravine that I have to consider as a threat. So I think that it's better to either get the Ojutai out or just leave up Snapcaster Mystic Confluence, because I don't really want to just take the time off to Faith's Fetters and get hit by the Raging Ravine. I'd rather make my opponent spend all the mana on the Batterskull, and then I can Snapcaster the Confluence to deal with the Germ again, and then Faith's Fetters the Batterskull after that. So it's really not an immediate concern. And if I get Ojutai down, I don't have to worry about the Raging Ravine racing me, because Ojutai wins the race. And I think that it's better to get the dragon down rather than to just sit on Snapcaster Mystic Confluence, because if my opponent just attacks me with the Raging Ravine, I could Snapcaster Confluence, draw 2 cards, and bounce it, but that's not the best use of it. I'd rather get this down, start winning, and then use this as a protection spell. And also, there's not a lot that I'm worried about my opponent resolving, since I have Faith's Fetters. If I'm desperate, Supreme Verdict, and Snapcaster can get Mystic Confluence or Unexpectedly Absent, plus Ojutai can find answers to things. So my opponent casts Bring Delight. I have no idea what to expect. And all they managed to come up with is a Courser of Kruphix, which is not very scary. They get a land off the top, but this is getting maybe a card a turn, which is much worse than what Dragonlord Ojutai is doing, so I'm not really worried about the inevitability that Courser of Kruphix offers. So I'm going to attack with Ojutai. And I don't think that Ancestral Vision is what I want at this point. The game is likely to be basically decided by the time that resolves. And my hand is not good for Thing in the Ice. Mana Leak is unlikely to matter, but I think it's better than the other options. Batterskull is pretty mana intensive. My opponent has things like Rakdos Return. So I take the Mana Leak. My opponent finds Regrowth after cracking the fetch land, and plays Bone Shredder. So I do not want Ojutai to die, so I'm going to Snapcaster the Confluence here. And so this is really interesting. My opponent has 5 mana up, so I could counter draw, or counter bounce Snapcaster. Either of those deals with the Bone Shredder, leaves Ojutai in play, and gets me ahead. Or I can get real cute and bounce my 2 creatures and draw a card, which forces my opponent to Bone Shredder their own Courser. It has the drawback of leaving the Bone Shredder in play, but then my opponent has a Bone Shredder in play instead of a Courser in play. I have to recast Ojutai and don't get a hit off of it, but my opponent also seemed to care a lot about this Courser. They did get it with Bring Delight. So it might have just been cuteness factor, but I decided to do that. I really don't know if it's better than just countering the Bone Shredder and bouncing the Snapcaster, but that's what I do. So I bounce my 2 guys, my opponent Bone Shredders the Courser, and then with the remaining 5 mana, equips Batterskull to the Bone Shredder, which I hadn't really considered how annoying this situation is. Now there's just this Bone Shredder that I don't really want to spend a turn dealing with and letting my opponent not pay the upkeep on, but as a 5/5 Vigilance, it's kind of a big problem for Ojutai, but I can play Ojutai, take a hit, and then fetters it, or Snapcaster Unexpectedly Absent the Batterskull or something. But I did not really consider exactly what this board ends up looking like, and wasn't really thrilled with the result. But I am just going to start by replaying Ojutai and discard a land. And my opponent decides not to pay for the Bone Shredder. I'm not really sure why. I think that paying for the Bone Shredder was definitely right at that point. Keeping a 5/5 flying lifelinking vigilance creature seems really good to me for 3 mana, but my opponent apparently has other plans, which I'm absolutely thrilled about since I have Mana Leak and Counterspell in my hand. So my opponent casts Ugin, which clearly is why they let the Bone Shredder die, but is not a play that works out well for them, as it actually lets me use this Force Spike that I wasn't really expecting to get any mileage out of. And that's basically where the game turned around. At this point, my opponent is tapped out. I have Ojutai, I have Counterspell, Snapcaster, Counterspell, with Mana Leak that might get to counter something. And my opponent has Batterskull, but I can Faith Fetters it and leave up the mana for the counterspells. So I basically can't lose at this point. And so that was really the critical turn. So Ojutai hits. I'm going to grab Dig Through Time rather than Shackles or Delver here, since I'm pretty close to being able to dig for 2 mana, and also I can just spend 4 mana to dig. I have a lot of mana at this point. And it lets me get basically any 2 cards from my deck. My opponent casts Bloodbraid Elf and hits Villainous Wealth, which is not a good hit. I figure I can just ignore the Bloodbraid Elf. It is not close to winning a race. And I'll just fire off the dig, leaving mana up to cast Counterspell, and take Brain Freeze and Thing in the Ice because I don't need the Jace, because it is primarily a card draw and like a card draw or life gain spell at this point, and neither one of those is at all relevant. So I'm just going to attack. My opponent's at 4. I have access to whatever I want. Take Shackles. Those are the only 2 spells left in my deck. And I'll just... I'm not sure what that mana is for. Yeah. I don't know what's going on with Moto here. Alright. I guess my opponent conceded or something. That kind of glitched out at the end, but I feel like I actually cast something there with the 2 mana. I don't know. Anyway, I think how that game ended is pretty clear. So in the third game, I'm down pretty far on the clock, of about half as much time as my opponent. And this hand it doesn't do anything. It doesn't interact early. But my opponent doesn't really do anything early, so it's pretty close. Like, I could keep this if I wanted and just try to hope to draw something. I do have a lot of early plays in my deck, but I decided to ship it, and I get this hand, which is maybe better. I kind of have 2 spells, kind of have 1 spell, but they're definitely cards that I want early in the game instead of cards that I want late in the game. I think I put Supreme Verdict on top, yeah. I don't want to get rid of a business spell. I figure this Delver will probably get killed, and this does answer some things that matter. And I miss with the Delver, and just attack for 1. My opponent plays a Signet. I flip the Delver and suspend Visions, which is a pretty good turn. I think accidentally play island instead of tapped land there. That's definitely wrong. Oh, maybe I decided that I wanted to threaten counterspell. Yeah. My opponent electrolyzes my Delver, so that fun is over. I draw Fetters, and now we're just hanging out. My opponent plays Bloodbraid and hits Villainous Wealth again. That's just good deck building. Attacks with the Bloodbraid. I draw Mystic Confluence. So obviously I'm kidding about the Villainous Wealth, but I do think that leaving Villainous Wealth in game 3 after seeing Daze and Force Spike and a bunch of other counter spells in a deck with Bloodbraid Elf is insane. There's no way you want a spell that costs all of your mana against a deck like this. Almost any other card would be better. My opponent casts a Xenagos, which gives me a great thing to use my counter and draw 2 cards card on. This card is insane. And I find 2 more counter spells, which is pretty perfect. So at this point in the game, I have 4 answers and a Snapcaster that is more of either kind of answer. My opponent has 4 cards in hand. I feel like I'm a pretty huge favorite in the game, but I don't actually know that it's going to be easy to win the game in the amount of time that I have left, since my deck is definitely not good at ending games. Also, I say that I have 4 answers plus the Snapcaster, which can be another answer, but really the Snapcaster is another Mystic Confluence, which is part of why it's so hard to lose from here. My opponent plays a Johnny, which I will mana leak before that card stops working on most things. I also have Ancestral Vision coming, so add that to my assets. And I'm just going to play the Thing in the Ice. Slightly awkward against a Faith Fetters Bloodbraid Elf, but I'll probably be fine if I manage to flip my Thing in the Ice. My opponent just immediately Maelstrom pulses, and I decided to let that happen. I thought about countering it. The main reason to counter it is basically just clock, wanting to keep my win condition in play, but realistically, this is not how I want to try to win the game. I'd rather just keep my counter spell and not worry about it. I have plenty of other... I don't need to be doing that here. Don't remember what my opponent regrowths. I missed the target there. It's not very important. I'll just counter whatever it is if it's something that mattered. So I just play a land. I don't use the Preordain because I don't really know what I need, and I'm fine just sitting here, leaving up Snapcaster. Oh yeah, that's what my opponent regrowth. I remember it was something weird. It was just Electrolyze to cycle and deal 2 rather than a Planeswalker. And I'll just take the 2, that's fine. My opponent plays a Signet and casts Jace, so I'm going to cash in my draw cards, counter your threat, get a threat in play. Except, actually, counter your threat, get my Snapcaster back. Draw a card. So I don't have a threat in play, but I do have another Snapcaster because I don't know how I lose this game when I have more counter spells. So now I can dig when I get a chance. Like, I decided that I have so much business here that I just don't want to... I don't want to let my opponent see my hand. I don't want to have to deal with this Mesmeric Fiend. I feel like I have the luxury of countering it at this point. And I cast Dig. And find Anticipate and Brain Freeze. And that's how I'm going to try to win this game. I have Brain Freeze Snapcaster. I cast Anticipate. Find Ojutai. And then cast Brain Freeze. to mill 15, which is not lethal, but I can use Snapcaster. So here I'm going to Preordain and cast Ojutai, and then Snapcaster, Brain Freeze. I want the Ojutai down in case my opponent somehow has an Eldrazi in their deck. I figure in Game 3, without me having seen any indication that they do or anything to do with it, and I don't think they've actually seen the Brain Freeze, it's not likely, but there's just no cost to getting the Ojutai down first. And this just works. My opponent runs out of cards and dies. So that's the first match.